So, yeah, I guess curiously enough, I came to Calgary just over 40 years ago now from Newfoundland, and originally as a drilling engineer. I worked for Gulf Canada Resources for a few years when I first came out here. And then shortly after that, I found myself kind of not satisfied with that kind of work and looking around for other things to do. And I ended up uh, spending some time in Central America, found myself in a master's program at the University of Calgary and looking at renewable energy in a small agricultural cooperative in Nicaragua in Central America. And that was where I guess I first came across the idea of sustainability. It was that challenge and created Sustainable Calgary to do just that. And specifically to answer one of the calls out of that Earth Summit, and that was how do we measure this thing called sustainable development? How do we now measure progress if it's something different that we've been used to? And that's where the State of Our City report came from. And then over the years, that State of the City report, we've maintained that over the last 25 years or so with regular updates on a set of 40 indicators that cut across social, ecological and economic domains in the city. But we've also used it as we always originally intended to, as a springboard, with the indicators themselves identifying what are the critical issues in our city, and then moving on to trying to tackle those issues on the ground with communities, community engagement, research, etc. And then that's eventually how I found myself as associate professor of sustainable development at the university, teaching mostly planners and urban designers this kind of material. And the book that you referenced was kind of a later addition to my work in the mid 2000s when I started writing a column in Fast Forward Weekly, which used to exist here in the city, which was really furthering reflections on that issue of sustainability and particular kind of issues of the day on a week-to-week basis in our city. And that was kind of the kernel of the book. And, I mentioned that the inspiration of this started with the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, and many of the people who eventually formed Sustainable Calgary Society actually had experience internationally working in international development and in other parts of the world. So we always brought that global perspective. And then coming around again to the book, its focus is asking about this question about how we transition in our city here in Calgary. But again, much of the book is trying to put our predicament in the global context of what's happening around sustainability and the kinds of lives that other people in other communities around the world are leading, and our relationship in this global economy to all of those other people in the planet.
Thank you. Noel, can you speak to the major challenges you faced over the years to be able to address the issues that were raised in the state of the city and your work towards the Agenda 21?
Yeah, I think in the unique circumstance of Calgary, I mean, most people would agree that for many Calgarians, we live a pretty high quality of life. Maybe the majority of Calgarians, not everybody, but the majority of Calgarians, we live a pretty high quality of life on average. We're wealthier than most Canadians and wealthier than most communities on the planet. So there's good in that. It means that we can raise families, we can live fulfilling lives, but it also kind of gives us a sense of a complacency, I guess, in the face of the larger global context and the major challenges that we face. So I think that's the biggest challenge in terms of engaging people in Calgary around sustainability, is to get kind of from a couple of angles, to get beyond that idea that, well, everything seems fine here, what are we worried about? So it's hard to gather that sense of urgency when you look at the way that we live comparatively to other people on the planet. And secondly, I think because of the nature of particularly climate change, I think it calls into question the way that we have been, the economy that we've built. We've built it on fossil fuels. Obviously, the burning of fossil fuels is the major component in the creation of the climate change and the climate emergency that we now face. So again, we have a very high quality of life, a very high standard of living. That standard of living has, for the most part, been built upon the resource that now is recognized as the most problematic resource when we try to tackle things like climate change. So I think those things together, getting over the complacency and then being able to start conversations that go to the core of what has made us a prosperous place is challenging for Calgarians. And I think that's, I mean, there are a lot of specific issues and technical issues around transportation and housing and energy and all kinds of things. But I think at the core, that's where the challenge for us as a city lies.
Thank you so much. And I can relate to this, even though my experience have been quite less than yours, but in sort of like my personal experience of living in Calgary as an environmental professional, or I guess someone who has studied it and is very concerned about it, but hasn't lived there all her life. So I lived there for 7 years, and I wasn't a native Calgarian, so maybe I didn't have that full Calgarian identity, but I was a resident of it. I do like to involve Tim here, because Tim is sort of like he shares the like similar experience than me, where like we maybe studied sustainability around the same time. But he's, I guess, like he lived in Calgary more than me, and I like to get kind of your experience as kind of a young Calgarian in this, and how do you make sense of it? Because when I've been talking with Tim, he has had more hope of how to tackle the issues you've raised, versus I wasn't able to project as much optimism as hope in my end of a spectrum. So I'm really interested to have Tim jump in here and talk to.
Sure. One of the things that, and I'm really curious to see how this conversation goes, but I definitely agree with Noel in terms of the complacency divide we have, and the differential, if you would, is a lot higher in Calgary in terms of the high standard of living we've been able to earn as a result of all the natural resources we've consumed and helped other people around the world consume. But as part of the ebbs and flows in that dynamic, in how Calgary has that kind of boom and bust mentality, one of the organizational ways that Calgary tried to manage that was by creating community associations, which are these loosely organized networks of volunteers. And what I see that the existence of that structure as being a powerful resource to enable us to address that complacency divide, if you would. It just has to be properly enabled with all the tools that digital technology and humans have created for organizing different movements together. You have to really be filtered through to the different neighborhood and community action groups.
Okay, interesting. And so you mentioned digital technology, and kind of, can you speak about where does the how does digital technology or other factors that you have been exposed to able to enhance the collective agency that we've been kind of referring to? And by agency, you and I may define it differently, but I'm thinking of what human elements that may be missing to be able to accelerate or overcome the challenge, these challenges.
Yeah, I recognize this is, we're talking really abstract, and so it can be hard to ground everything in. I'll start with one really simple story of a digital tool called Communal that was created by some former software engineers from another Calgary company called Benevity, that is now being shared around community associations and associations around Canada in order to help them organize more effectively. That is this really specific digital tool, but I think it's really more the structure that exists and the story that Calgarians can tell each other around how, when catastrophes like the flood happen, people can coordinate more effectively, and just the challenge is how to translate that kind of crisis mentality into the day-to-day actions. But Noel, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of community associations, yeah, I think that's one of the strengths that Calgary has, is a history of those community associations and the promise of them. I think if, that's the place where people, make human connections, and we can talk about the development of social capital, if you will, as a way that, that happens in part because of the existence of these community associations that have been so strong in bringing people together and bringing services to communities and being centers where, whether it's daycare or the local kids soccer league or whatever it might be, dealing with development issues around the community. I think that's definitely a strength that we have as a city. And what I like about that is it brings it down to the kind of grassroots or street level, where it is so much of it is about the relationships that are built up. And I think that's where we're going to have to lean on really heavily to deal with the issues that we face. I think in terms of some of the other strengths in Calgary, I do, when you see the response to things like the flood that happened, and our community was flooded out down here in Sunnyside. We have 6 feet of water in our basement, and the outpouring of volunteerism and people helping each other out was amazing. When you think about, people, older Calgarians talk a lot about the Olympics in 1988 and the amount of volunteerism that was engendered in that experience. And just generally, Calgarians, we like to think of ourselves as people who pitch in and volunteer, have a kind of a can-do spirit, all those kinds of things. And there are elements of that. And I think also another leverage that we have for tackling some of these issues. There's pros and cons to this, and that's the changing nature of the demographic in our communities. I mean, that goes right to the community associations as well, because I think one of the struggles a lot of inner city community associations have had is that it's tended to be run by older generation, which tended to be more white and middle class than, the new generation that is coming up in Calgary. And so kind of as a challenge and an opportunity, we have this huge amount of immigration over the past, say, 15 to 20 years in Calgary, where when I came here in the late 1980s, it was a very kind of a white city, and it's definitely not that right now. I think 41% of people are considered to be people of color or visible minorities. So that's almost half of our population, and it won't be very long before we'll be over half of our population. And that's a very young population, people coming in with education, with very different experiences of the world, with a lot of energy. We can see that. I mean, I can see it in the some of the contracts that I've worked on over the past few years in my role out in the community as a consultant, but also as a professor at the university. You can just see that youth and energy beginning to find its place in our community. And that's a tremendous asset that we have and will continue to have, paired with, or complicated, I guess, by also the kind of more socially conservative politics that we also find ourselves grappling with as well. So I think it's a very dynamic city in that way. There are lots of indicators pointing us in the right direction and lots of indicators pointing us in a different direction. And I guess we'll see where, when you use the word agency, how much agency emerges in dealing with those issues and kind of taking on the challenge that we face uniquely, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, in a place like Calgary, given the context we find ourselves in globally.
One thing I'm curious, Noel, that you mentioned is talking about how it is a very dynamic city. I know one of the things we talked earlier about was planning in a dynamic context. And I'm curious what you think planning in a dynamic context looks like with just the scope and urgency of the climate emergency. And if you think there's any ways that can tie into Calgary as a city and in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the dynamism comes from the rate of growth. So now we're up to, I don't know, 40,000 more people on a yearly basis, rivaling the fastest years of growth that we've had in the city because of the because of the uptick of oil again the last couple of years. So that itself, I think, is part of the ingredients to such a dynamic city, and the youth. The youthfulness of the city is part of that dynamic as well. In terms of how the city grows, again, it's kind of a double-edged sword where we have the opportunity, because there's so much growth, that if you look 10 years into the future, a big chunk of Calgary will have been built over the previous 10 years. And so we have the opportunity to build something differently, to take on this challenge with a new way of building. But at the same time, the dynamic can also lean towards, we're growing so fast, we don't have time to do things differently. We know how to build, say, suburbia really well. That's the easiest way to continue to build and to house these 40,000 people that come every year. So that's part of the challenge. I think how we get over that, I think we have to tap into as much of the dynamism as we can. I think the kind of the new tech sector and the entrepreneurial sector, there's a lot of activity there and new ways of thinking. And again, in terms of what I see, at least in terms of the development sector, I'm seeing a lot of youth and a lot of visible minorities, people of color, who are taking the reins of development. Whereas again, historically in Calgary, that's been a very an occupation or a niche that has been filled by an older, predominantly white demographic. So all of that, there's all of that that's in flux. That gives us, again, it's the challenge and the opportunity. I'm hopeful that the movements of the growth of a youthful dynamic, and a dynamic that gets us away from kind of just being seen as a society of a European white middle class society, is going to help us win the day and to set a new course in terms of development. I think also that because of that influx, we have more single family homes and more suburban development over the past 10 years, let's say, than any other big city in Canada. But along with that, we also have, so there's that kind of what is Calgary, or what has Calgary been, but we also have, again, this influx of new people and new ideas and new ways of living. People from all over the world that aren't used to living in single family dwelling suburbia, and are not, they're not clamoring for that lifestyle, because they know and understand and have been comfortable with a different kind of lifestyle. So I think that's all positive as well, where if the development community can pivot or make that shift to providing something different in the market, I think that's all good. And being able to engage that demographic in our community in the conversation about what our city is like, because I know, and better than I, Tim, at the local community level, there's lots of debate and discussion and tension about not only extending suburban development, but also how do you make existing communities more compact and invite more people into those communities at the same time.
I was thinking of bringing up diversifying the economy, and I think this goes very much in tandem of what you're talking about, in that we need to diversify our planning and development practices in the city, perhaps as a way of attracting different and diverse talents and markets and businesses and demographics. So that makes sense as we're talking about this, because it's been a question in my mind, and I know it's sort of like taking it in a different direction potentially, but then the city of Calgary has been trying to attract to diversify the economy for the last few years, and it's been a slow progress in my view. What do you guys think?
Well, if I'll just sort of throw in some of what I know from the research work that we've done with the State of Our City report, Sustainable Calgary, in those terms. So there's a couple of indicators that I think are crucial to understand here, and I agree with your estimation of it, Paris. One of the indicators is something we call the positions of power and influence. So that goes to the influence of this new new group, new dynamic, or new demographic that's making itself present in Calgary. And what we did with this indicator is that people, when we were creating the indicator report, people were interested in the idea of cultural diversity. And then the question is, well, how do we measure this cultural diversity? And we started by thinking, well, the easy statistics that are available are just, what percentage of Filipinos, what percentage of Indians, what percentage of Germans, what percentage of South Africans live in our city, which is pretty straightforward, but doesn't really, it's not that exciting. So what we came up with was, well, let's look at positions of power and influence. So we identified in the neighborhood of 250 positions of power and influence, which included all of our elected representatives from school boards up to MPs at the federal level, major TV and radio personalities, and the heads of the boards of directors of the major not-for-profit organizations in our city, like the United Way, and the 5 largest corporate employers in our city. And out of that group, we compared the diversity of that group of people with the diversity of the city. And what we've found consistently in our indicators report that is that the diversity of that group falls far short of the diversity of our city. So that's kind of one response to it. And then in terms of the economic side, again, this was an interesting story that started way back 25 years ago when we started this indicator work. And I had a chance to talk to Mayor Al Dewar at the time. And we were trying to, again, looking at economic diversity, as people said, well, that's important to talk about economic diversity in this state of our city report, the sustainability indicators. So we thought, okay, how do we measure economic diversity? And what we came around to was the flip side of that, which is something that Seattle had done because they were very dependent on, in their case, Boeing Industries. So we looked at, well, how dependent are we upon the oil and gas industry? So we came up with an oil and gas reliance index. And we talked to a lot of people, whether it's researchers at the university, because curiously, there was a lot of interest at the time in economic diversification. And when you read the newspapers and listened to the news, a lot of people were talking about the diversification of our community. And that was in the mid-1990s or late 1990s. Mayor Al Dewar had talked about it, so I had a chance to approach him in a meeting and ask him, what data do we have? There were researchers at Haskayne School of Business who were quoted in the newspapers about talking about it. So we called them up and asked them about the research you had. And there wasn't a lot of research to back up the aspiration or the idea that we were diversifying. So our oil and gas reliance index looked at the contribution of direct employment and contribution to GDP and contribution to the province's import and export balance of the oil and gas industry. And over time, we have followed that with our indicators since the mid-1990s and have not found, based on that particular indicator, not a lot of diversification. I'm not saying that there hasn't been diversification. And again, Tim probably knows more about the sectors where that we are seeing diversification. But in terms of at least that indicator in our reporting, we're not seeing a lot of movement in terms of our reliance on that particular industry. The number of people directly employed has certainly gone down, but its economic influence and impact and dependence is still very much felt. And we can see that again in the latest boom and bust that we're experiencing, how wildly we fluctuate between profit and loss at a provincial level based on the price of oil.
Really interesting. It probably speaks to the fact that even though there may be a lot of talk about the need to move towards this, to move toward a certain direction, but the action may be lagging beyond. In this case, the talk for diversification has been going on longer than I thought. I thought it was just the last five years, but it's been going on for 25 years. It probably speaks to that. So we could talk about climate change a lot, but then if the actions are lagging, then we may not accelerate as much as we think or we want to move towards.
Yeah, I'd be curious about Tim's perspective on. I think, that's just one set of indicators that we hit upon, have been reporting on, and I do know there's diversification in different sectors, and it's something that I think Tim has more of a pulse on. So I'd be curious about your perspective, Tim, and where are we at with that diversification? Do you think? I know there are a lot of people interested in different industrial sectors and are doing lots of work and making some inroads. But where do you think, kind of, where are we at in that journey in the city right now?
Well, I think about it in two ways. One, I know that there is diversification in terms of there's a lot bigger tech companies in Alberta than there ever have been. We have Benevity and Solium and Neo Financial. These are all almost multi-billion-dollar companies that have been headquartered in Calgary, but they also face their own challenges. And they face the challenge of, because capital is so fluid, it comes into Calgary to sometimes take advantage of the efficiencies of scale that the oil and gas industry has generated, rather than to actually base value here. And I think this kind of problem is part of what made the tech industry grow in the Silicon Valley so quickly. Was they realized that in order to create value is either going to be based off of scarce resources or collaboration. And that kind of ties into where I think the second way I think about this, and why I think the work of Sustainable Calgary is so important, is if value comes out of collaboration, the way we measure and enable collaboration and coordination becomes the most important driver of value. So we have in Alberta, we have the natural resources, which you have to use some coordination to get there, but to create the value, but it's fundamentally tied to this scarce resource that, unfortunately, when we put it into the environment, pollutes the planet. But we have to find better ways to coordinate and enable collaboration itself as the value, which I think it's not just some mystical kumbaya future. It's fundamentally tapping into how humans enjoy connection. The opposite of addiction isn't avoidance, it's connection. So whether that's connection with our neighborhood and community, or connection with ourselves, connection with the environment. And those are all things that I think Calgary can be poised to do better, to do very well in, and more importantly, to tell the story of how we do those things well to the world, because we have the juxtaposition of the transition. Humans gravitate towards transitions in storytelling, and it's something that we can, by bettering ourselves, we can help inspire other places and have positive impact that way.
Really interesting. I was reading a book. It does the name escapes my mind, but it's about collaboration in Silicon Valley, and how that's kind of trying to translate it to Alberta, the kind of the value, taking collaboration as a and internalizing it in how you place common value with different players of the economy and the society was one of the key indicators. There were kind of the idea of, we talk about the ecosystem that we are embedded in, but then kind of actually looking at it as looking at our society as an ecosystem where all the parts are interreliant and interconnected to one another, and there isn't a power dynamic. And kind of the shift to that is something that I think would, like, having that mindset shift could be quite valuable in economies like Alberta, where collaboration has been happening, but not in that sense. There's been always that excuse me, that big oil in the past, and other sectors, like Tim has been alluding to, have been coming, but they haven't interacted in a cohesive way.
One thing that I, from my own lived experience, because I was raised very dogmatically to think one way, and then I realized I was completely wrong about almost everything. And I'm sure it won't be the last time, but I feel that there's just that it's almost always easy to find a reason to not coordinate with your neighbor or not coordinate with someone close by. It's harder to find a reason to not coordinate with someone who's far away, because you know less about them. Whereas it's easy to find a reason to not coordinate with people who live close by. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I know, Noel, we've talked in the past about some of the ecological districts, or almost designing municipal, like, or for example, organizing urban planning around a specific district like Manchester and Calgary. I think more energy behind those kind of initiatives can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of I mean, that's certainly one fruitful, if we want to talk about really how we're going to transform things, I think thinking of just political and economic boundaries is one way to think about that. A lot of people, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of people in Calgary would be interested in seeing more political power at a more local level, whether it's the community level or clusters of communities, which might be a district level, might be, imagine it as what we'd think of now 5 or even 10 communities as a district, but devolving more political power and agency to those levels. We can also think about it in terms of, there's the idea of bioregionalism, where you align your political boundaries with your ecological boundaries. So, for example, watersheds would be one obvious way to do that. So to think of political boundaries based upon ecological boundaries. Another way to think about it culturally is, I think all of Alberta is under some kind of treaty regime. Maybe we're Treaty 7. Maybe we begin to think of political boundaries along treaty lines, which gets us to think in a very different way, because we now have to deal with our treaty obligations, with reconciliation, with reconciling very different cultures in terms of how we view the natural world and our relationship to it. All those kinds of things would come into play if we took up those kind of political boundaries. I mean, that's kind of big sky thinking, but it would be very interesting to pursue some of those ideas as a way to find that kind of passageway to transformation that may be possible. The other thing that comes up in the last few remarks to me too, and I'll go back to another couple of the indicators in the State of Our City report, when we talk about the need for collaboration and cooperation, and justice and equity put into the mix there as well. And on top of Calgary having become, since the 1970s, late 1970s, the most wealthy part of the nation, we've also become the most unequal in some measures. And again, in our State of Our City report, we look at a measure that is looking at the income, the wealth of the top 20% of Calgarians in comparison to the wealth of the bottom 20% of Calgarians, and that has been rising over time, and it is a greater number than in most other jurisdictions in Canada. So on top of, in the midst of the period when we've become fantastically wealthy and our standard of living has risen, that inequality has also risen, and that's problematic for notions of transformation and change and transition, because so much of literature points to the need for trust and for some sense of justice, for people to buy into what can be sometimes scary transition and change. And if there is not that sense of justice or sense of trust, then people are going to push back against notions of change, because they think, well, I'm not in a good situation now, and any kind of change is maybe going to be more difficult for me, so I'm not going to buy into that idea. So we start thinking about climate change, or even right down at the community level about making more compact neighborhoods. You start to get that pushback if you don't have the requisite sense of social justice and the requisite sense of trust in communities and among ourselves.
Noel, you touch on so many important points in that. I mean, the conversation has all been, of course, relevant and important, but the trust and the lack of trust and social, and the need for improving the social justice is really important in advancing sustainability issues, advancing climate action on the regional, on the municipal as well as the regional level. And I've kind of, so how do we how do we enhance the social capital that you mentioned earlier? Because I imagine that's how you can elevate trust in the communities too, in light of the more, I should say, adversarial regional atmosphere that we're in these days.
I can jump in with a really simple story, and that is, and then Noel, feel free to carry on from there. But the place I'm living in now, I just moved in because a friend of mine, I knew his basement wasn't being lived in, and I was able to facilitate that in my own neighborhood, and then move into that space. And then the place I was in before, I was living with 4 roommates, and we did simple things where it was just like we had weekly clean the house and then organize a bit of a party together each week. And that's something that I started in that community. And as you do things like that with more and more of our neighborhood groups, I think trust has to be built at the grassroots level first. And then as part of it being built at the grassroots level in a close geographic space, then it can really blossom in 100 different ways outside of there. But it's very hard for humans to build trust without a tribe. And I think one of the few ways to create a tribe that is actually just is just doing it based off of who's close by. So you can't do it based off any other bias you have other than who is closest to you.
So Tim, I love that. So from the bottom up, from the grassroots, is how we can build the social capital, which lead to trust. Does it mean that we don't need any much action from the top for this? No. So
No,
this comes from communities. So the trust of I find like Albert, myself, or maybe myself, so we could lack trust in the politics, in the way, in the political action.
I think it has to come. It has to really be started at the neighborhood level, and then, that'll help it the most. But I'm curious what Noel thinks in terms of, in terms of top, more political level.
Yeah, well, I agree that it's. I mean, to me, it comes from all levels. So I'll say it that way. I agree with Tim that it. Again, I think we have the opportunity in Calgary because the way we're structured at a local level to build that. But it has to start with being able to talk to your neighbors and get along with your neighbors. And it also in Calgary now, what I'm seeing is that the tensions that are coming about from social and economic tensions are fraying that trust, and particularly. I'm most familiar with the inner city because I've lived most of my life in Calgary in the inner city. You see a lot more people struggling and deprivation on our streets these days. And I think that's a dangerous thing to see and to let happen, because as that kind of creeps in, then people begin to trust less, and people begin to, some people can express compassion and empathy when they see that, and other people are afraid and they want someone to do something about it. And I think we're seeing both kinds of reactions in our community. And I think that's another thing that I talk about in the book is, I think it's vital to, 3 things that I would say: empathy, compassion, and humility are 3 things that are vital for us to kind of find a path forward. So the local is really important. Again, looking at some of the indicators and kind of the arc of the book, our book as well is, one of the indicators we have is sense of community. So that gets at that local idea for sure. And what we draw on there is for lack of any better indicators, is work that's been done by Statistics Canada that just asks people at the local level, how much do they trust their neighbors, or how many do you have neighbors you could turn to in a crisis in the middle of the night, and how much trust do you have, or how much connection, how connected do you feel to your community? Those kinds of questions. So that's one of the indicators that gets at that local level. But then it does also, I think, goes to the political and social level as well. So for example, I talked about some of the economic indicators and the disparity economically, in that economic injustice that we see that has, I think, objectively grown over the past several decades. And if that is also a strong basis for establishing the trust that we require. So if there is that economic injustice and people can see it more and more, then that is going to erode trust. And at the political level, we also, a couple of indicators we talk about is we have an indicator that tracks donations to political campaigns of municipal leaders. So we ask a question, how much did it cost for each of the councillors to win their seat in the last municipal election? And we looked at, in the latest report, we looked at 2017 and 2014 and 2017, I think it was, two periods of elections. And in the earlier election, the average winning councillor spent $45,000 on their campaign, and in the subsequent election, the average winning councillor spent about $145,000 on their campaign. So that speaks to the influence of money in elections, and that again is erosive to trust and a strong social fabric when money speaks so loudly in elections. And then the other one is just sort of the structure of our electoral system and our democracy. And to that one, we look at an indicator of what we call unearned seat average. So this has to do with the fact that we have a first past the post system versus a proportional representation system. So in a proportional representation system where, say, for example, most of Scandinavia functions at a local or say a provincial and a national level as a proportional representation, it means that there's a very close alignment between the number of votes that you get as a particular party, the percentage of votes that you get, and the percentage of seats you get in a parliament or legislature in a proportional system. In our first past the post system, there's a huge skewing between the percentage of the votes that you receive and the percentage of the seats that you receive. And in general, the winning party or the party that forms government, in Alberta, for example, in federal terms, you look at our federal seats, typically over the last 30 years of elections, the dominant party, which has for most of that time, for pretty much all of that time, been a Conservative party, just happens to be the Conservative Party in Alberta, wins maybe 65 to 70% of the votes, and they get 90 to 95% of the seats. So when you have that kind of a situation consistently over decades, where essentially the people who are representing you, say in the Parliament in Canada, are not representative of the citizens, then that's a recipe for trouble. And I think that's one of the things, so at that provincial and federal level, that's one of the things we struggle with, is that our democracy is not really functioning those well because of those dynamics, those structural issues. So all of that, from federal and provincial elections, the way we run municipal elections and the influence of money, right down to how connected we feel with our communities. I think all of that has to harmonize in a positive way for us to kind of move forward, as you were talking about, Tim.
But to build off of that, I really think that the most powerful thing that we can do is strengthen those like hyper-local connections at a neighborhood level. Because for my own time running for council, I realized just how important those are in order to, because it creates social capital, so that social capital can outweigh the influence of financial capital. But it's very easy for social capital to be eroded because we're always reading news reports, we're always reading different stories that will give us more and more reasons to distrust people who are closest to us, which is a tool of colonialism as much as colonialism is itself just something that is based off of external powers influencing a local decision. Thank you, Tim.
And the way I understand Noel's perspective, those indicators that were kind of eroding kind of speak to that would basically erode the trust that we were talking about in our governance. For me, it speaks to how important it is to have this ongoing dialogue and enhance civic engagement on these conversations. Of course, as Tim has been mentioning, it's kind of building from the grassroots is really important, but having that conversation amongst our communities of how we could make the systemic changes for the better.
I want to make a really quick distinction between grassroots and neighborhood, because I think that's an important thing to distinguish, because grassroots doesn't always have to mean neighborhood, but I think the most powerful grassroots actions are neighborhood based.
Thank you for that. That makes sense. I was mainly distinguishing the kind of the overall and then kind of the community level, but that's an important distinction. Thank you very much both. I really love to continue the conversation, as I know we could take it in different directions, but I think it's always good to take a break and maybe kind of get some comments from others, and have a breather ourselves, and then come back to it. I myself, as a podcast listener, have a short attention span of less than an hour, unfortunately. So relating to others, I want to kind of split things up, but then I really learned a lot, especially kind of as a general takeaway of how to enhance agency and trust and social capital, the elements of of empathy, compassion, and humility really stuck in my mind. That kind of encompasses a lot of things. Of course, the State of Our City report, I love to go back to it. And then, and Noel, when's the next one coming out? So that would be, are we due for one very soon?
Well, we're aiming to put another one out in 2024. So it's kind of more or less 3 to 4 years, every 3 to 4 years that we've been able to put one out. I mean, one of the reasons for that is, well, it's hard work, but also a lot of data comes from places like Statistics Canada and the census, and that only happens every 4 years. So yeah, 3 to 4 years. So we're aiming now to put another report out in 2024, and we're just getting started on that process, I guess.
Yes, and Sustainable Calgary, of course, is the, I believe it's the kind of the organization that leads it, or is there ways that Calgarians can help with the organization, or with the earlier release of this, aside from the statistical release standpoint?
Well, we are going to open up the process this year. We're still kind of working on what that process will look like, but it's been 25 years and we've developed this suite of 40 indicators. And I think we're thinking that it's time to kind of relook at those, and maybe we have to make, so one thing would be to have a look at the indicators that we do have and see if there are missing ones that we need to add, and ones that maybe we can remove and replace with something better. So that kind of process is going to happen. And then we also really want to look at, because of the digital age now, and the people rely so much of accessing things online, there's a lot more graphic capacity for producing material. So trying to kind of update our report from those perspectives as well, how to present the data, how to make it more graphic and engaging, and kind of the balance between producing hard copies of things that are going to be on people's shelves versus access digitally, those sorts of questions, as well as the indicators themselves that we think it's time now to revisit that question. And so we're going to be kind of casting out and inviting people to get involved in all of those kinds of levels as we, over the next year, as we put together the next report. So yeah, there'll be, you guys can expect a notice of invitation to get involved in some of that stuff.
If I can put in a quick plug also for something that is coming up on May 5th, 6th, and 7th, is the Janes Walks in and around Calgary. They're being organized by the Federation of Calgary Communities this year, and there's going to be art walks, silly walks, nature walks, history walks, Janes Walks welcomes it. So there's going to be a lot of different things, and people can just get to work in their own community and walking around.
Love it.
That's
I've
awesome.
been to Jane Walks, and I totally recommend it. And unfortunately, I missed the silly walk. I'm so sad, but hopefully you guys can join. Thank you very much, you both, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.